You might have seen a graph that looks something like this, that makes the claim that only 7% of communication is carried with spoken words. 38% is tone of voice, and 55% is body language. This claim is everywhere. These are just some examples. This website says Dr. Albert Mehrabian found that 93% of communication is nonverbal. This assisted living site says, but did you know that only 7% of communication is the spoken word? The remaining 93% has to do with voice inflection, tone, posture, and other forms of body language. Published by Forbes, Mehrabian's extensive research on the topic of body language resulted in the 738-55 rule. The 738-55 rule indicates that only 7% of all communication is done through verbal communication, whereas the nonverbal components of our daily communication, such as the tonality of our voice and body language, makes up 38% and 55%. Entrepreneur magazine says Dr. Albert Mehrabian is known for his breakdown of human communication into 7% spoken words, 38% tone of voice, and 55% body language. While some disagree on those numbers, all agree nonverbal communication dominates verbal. And this instructional brochure says nonverbal cues make up around 93% of how we communicate with each other. Where does this 93% of communication is nonverbal? Where does that come from? You hear this one source again and again, Dr. Albert Mehrabian. Who the heck is Dr. Albert Mehrabian? Well, he is a PhD from Clark University, and he is a longtime professor at UCLA. What were Dr. Mehrabian's experiments that led to the idea that 93% of communication is nonverbal or implicit communication? How did he come up with this 738-55 rule? This comes from two studies that he did in 1967. In the first study, he had 3 positive words, honey, thanks, and dear, 3 neutral words, maybe, really, and oh, and 3 negative words, don't, brute, and terrible. When we talk about this 738-55 rule, we should know it comes from experiments that limited verbal communication to a single word. In the first experiment, when people heard the word dear in a positive tone, they concluded it was a positive message. When they heard dear in a negative tone, they concluded it was a negative message. When they heard terrible in a positive tone, they said that's positive. When they heard terrible in a negative tone, they said that's negative. The conclusion was that people pay attention to the tone of voice over the content of the word. Experiment number 2 went something like this. If you saw this face and you heard someone say the word maybe in a negative tone, you were likely to say that the message was negative. If you saw this face and you heard the word maybe in a positive tone, you concluded it was positive. The conclusion was people paid attention to facial expression in the photo and the tone of voice, the nonverbal communication, more than the meaning of the word. And maybe was specifically chosen because it was deemed to be a neutral word. What Dr. Mehrabian did was he took these 2 separate experiments and combined the results. The clear limitations here are that words were limited to 1 word at a time, and the content of the message was not judged, only the emotions. Let's go back to the article that Forbes published saying only 7% of all communication is done through verbal communication. This is absolutely wrong. Mehrabian's experiments did not study the understanding of the content of the messages. He studied the emotional understanding embedded in the messages. And we can go directly to what Dr. Mehrabian said himself. My findings are often misquoted. Clearly, It is absurd to imply or suggest that the verbal portion of all communication constitutes only 7% of the message. Suppose I want to tell you that the eraser you are looking for is in the second right-hand drawer of my desk in my third floor office. How could anyone contend that the verbal part of this message is only 7% of the message? But could we still say that 93% of the emotional content of a message is carried by nonverbals? If you claim this and you use Morabian as your proof, then your proof is experiments that limited words to a single word. What if someone speaks many words, speaks in sentences? Do we tend to believe the tone of voice and facial expression over the words used in sentences? Morabian did not study that. Let's run our own experiment. If only 7% of communication is verbal, then if there was a video clip that had tone of voice, facial expression, and other nonverbal information, but lacked understanding of words, then you should be able to understand 93% of the content of that message. Let's test this out. Watch this clip and write down what the man in the white coat says to Brad Pitt. If only 7% of communication is verbal, you should have a good idea what was said using all of the nonverbal implicit information that is provided.
Mélangez, Monsieur Berne. La carte la plus forte gagne.
What did the man in the white coat say to the other man, Brad Pitt? Shuffle, highest card wins. And then we had an added question. If you were Brad in this moment and you needed to do something, what would you do? It was just another way of asking the same question. This was scored on a binary system. Only two potential outcomes. You got 1 point if you could clearly state the request. Shuffle the cards. You did not have to state highest card wins. You received no points if you could not clearly state the request. What were the results of the experiment that we conducted? There were 26 who watched the clip relying only on the nonverbals. 0% could determine the message correctly. If you had only the words and you had none of the nonverbals, then 26 out of 28 were able to determine the message correctly. Let's turn to experiment number 2. You were asked to watch the clip and write down what did the man want Brad Pitt to write. If only 7% of communication is verbal, you should have a good idea what was said using all of the wonderful nonverbal information that's provided in the clip.
Monsieur Berne, écrivez-moi la formule chimique de phosphate, s'il vous plaît.
He asked him, please write me the chemical formula for phosphate. How this was scored: 1 point if you could clearly state the request to write a formula. Correctly stating phosphate or anything more specific was not necessary. The results: those only having the video clip in French without subtitles, you scored 0%. Nobody was able to say he was asked to write a formula. But if you received only the words and you didn't have any of the video content, then absolutely everyone was able to correctly say what the content of the message was. As we close experiment number 2, the question is, if your life depended on your understanding and doing what you were asked to do, Would you like to have nonverbals, tone of voice, inflection, rate of speech, facial expressions, body language, or would you like to understand the words, if your life depended on it? When you were provided the nonverbals only, your accuracy rate was 0. But when you're given only the words and none of the nonverbals, your accuracy rate was 100%. These tests asked about the content of the message, not about emotions. How important are nonverbals in understanding the emotional content of the message? For that, we need to run another experiment. Experiment number 3. You are asked to watch clip number 3 and answer, what is the man saying to the woman? And what is the man's attitude towards the woman? You were told you could only select one emotion from the list, and then you were given the opportunity to write in a better emotion if it didn't exist on the list.
Ils sont tous les mêmes, les journalistes. Ils vous posent toujours les mêmes questions. Quel effet ça fait d'être une femme célèbre? Qu'est-ce que ça vous fait qu'on vous demande des autographes, qu'on vous reconnaisse dans la rue? Malgré toutes leurs émissions sur le cinéma, j'ai jamais vu un reportage à la télévision montrant qu'une actrice au tournage, c'est une femme qui se lève à 6 heures du matin et qui rentre à 9 heures chez elle. Total, 15 heures de travail.
The man says, reporters always ask the same questions. How does it feel to be famous? To be asked for autographs, recognized in public. But no TV program I've seen has ever shown that an actress on a film shoot gets up at 6 o'clock and gets home at 9 p.m., a 15-hour workday. A correct score was given to any response that said he was saying how difficult it was to be an actress, or that people think the life of an actress is glamorous, or people don't realize how hard an actress works. Anything along those lines, you received 1 point. If you didn't say something like that, you received 0 points. If you had the clip in French with no subtitles, nobody was able to say what the correct message was. If you had just the words and no nonverbals at all, 26 out of 28 people were correctly able to state what the message was. So far, the theory of nonverbal communication is not holding up very well. But part of this experiment was to look at the emotions. Maybe nonverbals don't do very well letting us know what the content of the message is, but maybe they do really well helping us understand the emotions of the message. Let's take a look at that. Question 4 is, what is the man's attitude towards the woman? And you can only select one. You were given 1 point if you stated a positive emotion. You were given no points if you stated a negative emotion. The way he was speaking, it sounded angry or frustrated, but he was actually not expressing negative emotions towards the actress. He was being appreciative. He was being sympathetic that no one appreciates how hard you work as an actress. The final results, if you only had the video clip with the tone of his voice and his body language, only 2 out of 23 thought the man had a positive attitude towards the woman. If you received only the words without hearing his tone of voice, then it was split. Half thought it was positive, half thought it was negative. Experiment number 4. Same design as 3, judging both emotions and content. What is the man on the phone saying to the woman, and what is the man's attitude towards the woman? You're asked to select only one, and then after you select one, you can write in something that you think would be a better answer.
Hello.
Allô, Julie, c'est Alphonse.
Oui, c'est moi.
Écoutez, Julie, je vais m'en aller. Je pars cette nuit et je voulais vous le dire à vous, parce que vous avez toujours été très loyale avec moi. Je n'ai rien dit à Ferrand, alors vous le préviendrez.
Alphonse, il faut absolument que je vous parle. Attendez-moi.
Au revoir, Julie, et merci pour tout.
Attendez-moi.
The man on the phone says, Julie, it's Alphonse. I'm leaving tonight. I wanted to tell you first because you've always been honest with me. Tell Fernand for me. The woman says, I have to talk to you. Wait. The man says goodbye and thanks. The woman says, wait for me. Thanking her, telling her that he's leaving, that gets you a correct score. For the nonverbal only group, nobody was able to say what the message was correctly. But if you had the words, everyone was able to say correctly. What about the emotions? He was thanking her. He had positive emotions towards her. If you stated any of the positive emotions, it was listed as being correct. You could say appreciative, caring, content, happy, proud. If you stated a negative emotion, it was marked as incorrect. If you had the video clip in French without the subtitles, the most common answer about the emotions was negative, that he's annoyed or frustrated at her. If you had only the words, the most common answer is being appreciative or caring. With only the nonverbals, here 4 out of the 25 people, or 16%, were able to correctly interpret the emotions. If you had only the words, 25 out of 28 were able to correctly interpret the emotions. Again, showing only having the words far outperforms having everything but the words. Let's go on to the final experiment. Experiment number 5. What is the woman in yellow and black saying to the woman in the white shirt? And pick the word that best describes the emotions of the woman in yellow and black. On this question, we're not asking about what are her emotions towards the other woman. We're just asking about her emotions in general.
Vraiment, en plus, je ne comprends vraiment pas pourquoi Ferrand m'a prise pour ce film. Il me déteste, il ne me supporte pas, alors vraiment.
Où as-tu été chercher une chose
Oh,
pareille?
ça, alors là, vraiment, j'en suis sûre. En plus, il me trouve très mauvaise. Marc, entre nous, il n'a pas tort. Je suis sûre que c'est même pas lui qui m'a choisi, le producteur, enfin, j'en sais rien, moi. Il y a quelque chose de bizarre dans ce film.
J'ai jamais entendu parler de quelqu'un d'autre pour le rôle.
The woman in yellow and black, she says, I didn't know why Fernand cast me. He can't stand me. The woman in the white shirt said, where'd you get that idea? The woman in yellow and black says, and I know he thinks I'm a lousy actress. Just between us, he may be right. No, he didn't cast me. Was it the producer? There's something strange about this film. The woman in white says, he never considered anyone else. The woman in yellow and black says, really? The woman in white says, I'm positive. Come on. In assessing content, what did the woman in yellow and black say to the woman in the white shirt? You could say anything along these lines. You don't have to say all of it. If you said that she's expressing self-doubt, that she's suspicious about the film, she's questioning why she was cast and who cast her, or generally talking about her role in the film, any of that would get you a correct answer. If you couldn't say any of that, you got an incorrect answer. If you only had the nonverbals, 0% were able to correctly say what the message was. If you only had the words, your accuracy rate was 96%. Having nonverbals alone is not doing well determining what the content of the message is. How about the emotions? Her emotions were deemed to be negative, with the prime emotion being distrustful or frustrated. But you didn't have to narrow it down to a particular negative emotion. Just any negative emotion would have been scored correct. If you only had the nonverbals, your most common answer was that she was frustrated or annoyed. If you had the words, your most common answer was that she was distrustful. Each falls into the correct category of negative emotions, but with the words, you were more accurate. You were able to narrow it down to this prime emotion of distrustfulness. 75% came up with the right answer, but if you had the words and you didn't have any of the visuals, then you were up to 96%. If we put all of this together for a summary of our results, if you only had the nonverbals, in terms of content, you were 0% successful in judging correctly what the content of the message was. But if you had the words and you didn't have the nonverbals, you were 96% successful. For the emotions, If you had just the nonverbals, you were 30.9% accurate in judging the correct emotional state. If you had the words, and only the words, you were 78.5% successful. Let's go back to one of these articles. Let's pick the one from Entrepreneur. All agree nonverbal communication dominates verbal. Let's test this 738-55 rule. It would predict that implicit, the nonverbal communication, would be 93% accurate. How did it do in our experiments? In judging content, it was 0% accurate. And in judging emotions, it was 30.9% accurate. The 738-55 rule would predict that words would only be 7% accurate. How did it do in terms of judging content? Words were 96.4% accurate. And how were words for judging emotion? 78.5% accurate. Not everyone agrees that nonverbal communication dominates verbal. We look at a bunch of limitations and critiques for this study. A criticism here could be that this study selected clips where the content and the correct emotional state was incongruent with the perceived emotional state. And this could explain why the implicit, the nonverbal communication, was a poor predictor of the correct emotional state. And I would say to that, absolutely true. And I would also add that Mehrabian's experiments, just like this, were designed to study incongruent messages where emotions did not match the message. A criticism is a limitation of the study is the male-female was not well balanced. This is absolutely true. The total sample size, there were only 6 men versus 26 females. However, Mehrabian's experiments were all female. You could criticize the study for the sample size. There were only 32. However, for Mehrabian, for study number 1, his total experimental sample size was 30. For experiment number 2, he had 17. In this study, we had 32. You can criticize this as being a small sample size, but it's hard to do that and hold up Mehrabian's work at the same time. There are a bunch of recommendations for future study design, but ultimately they boil down to this one question. Are future studies on this really needed? To partially address that question, let's look at this from Harvard Law School's Program on Negotiations. This was from June 23rd of 2022. And in the first sentence they write, about 93% of our interactions with other people are nonverbal, according to an influential 1972 study by researcher Albert Mehrabian. Albert Mehrabian's work continues to be cited. So let's end with a direct quote from Dr. Mehrabian.
Unfortunately, a lot of people, I don't know what their reasons are, but they decided to overgeneralize my findings and make them sound as if they were for communication in general, which would be absurd. I can give you many examples to show you how absurd it would be to make that contention for general communication.
I want to thank everyone who participated by watching the clips, taking the survey, sending in your answers. This couldn't have been done without you. Thank you for being part of the team that has busted this myth.